Welcome everyone to this evening's event. I am Scott Edgar. I'm the former Assistant Arts and Cultural Programmer at Belfast Linen Hall Library. For those of you unfamiliar with the library, we're the oldest such institution in Belfast, and we're the only library in Ireland that still generates a proportion of our income from membership. So if you enjoy this evening's event or any of our events or the general work of the library, please do visit our website and you can find out more there about becoming a member. Like I said, I will keep everyone on mute throughout the event. If you have any questions or comments for our speakers, please place them in the chat box on Zoom and we will return to them at the end if time permits. This evening is our Burns and Mozart, A Strange Concord pre-concert conversation as part of the Enlightenment Festival at the Linen Hall Library. The concert itself will take place on Saturday, the 30th of April in the Presbyterian Assembly Halls in Belfast, or simply Church House, as many locals know the building. Tickets for the recital are available on linenhall.com. This evening, we're joined by Patrick Mackie, a poet, a visiting fellow at Harvard, and the author of Mozart in Motion, His Work and His Work in Pieces. Unfortunately, Professor Kirstine McHugh, co-director of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies at University of Glasgow, is unable to join us this evening. So we're very grateful to writer, presenter, broadcaster, and one of the newest members of the team at the Scottish Poetry Library, Alistair Heather, for stepping in at short notice. For the next while, we will hear a little more about the work of both Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Robert Burns, and look at the very different lives both these artistic geniuses lived during the Enlightenment period. And so for now, I will hand over to Ian Burnside, who will chair this evening's session.
Thank you very much, Scott. Well, here we are with two defining geniuses of their nation, a Scotsman and an Austrian. A Scotsman who has his own night, Burns Night, and an Austrian who has his own little chocolate delicacy, Mozart Kugeln. They have quite a lot in common. Their lives overlapped almost spookily in terms of dates. They both died in their 30s. They both had many children, several of whom died in childbirth. So we are here to put them side by side and see if comparing and contrasting brings revelations from my two distinguished colleagues. So gents, first of all, why don't we just go back to childhood and set up the parameters of how these two men headed in the direction of later genius. Alistair, would you like to kick off with Mr. Burns?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everyone. It's absolutely lovely to be here, and thanks very much for thinking of me as your coming off the subs bench alternative. I'm very happy to make up the numbers tonight. It should be a fascinating talk. So Burns as somebody that became a great kind of codifier, curator, gatherer of Scots folk song, somebody that really helped establish Scottish folk song as the incredible tradition that it is, began at a very young age. He was raised in rural, relative poverty, at times biting poverty, and a lot of his early education was done in the home, and it came from his mother and another older female relative who came to stay with them as her health was failing in her later years. Burns talked so much in his later life about how his mum was always singing. She was one of the great tradition bearers. They exist in Scotland still. The people that just ken all the songs fae their part of the world, who sing them all through. They know all the great ballads from medieval Scotland. They know the folk songs of the day. And Burns was raised very, very early in that song tradition. He then added to that by his father was always keen that he should get a decent education, as decent as they could manage. So when he was spared from the farm, he would be given private tuition as much as could be afforded to introduce him to literature. And Burns, the young man, really emerged from this melding of the really rich folk song tradition of his background and also the more literary study of the English poets at the time, your Alexander Popes and folk of that ilk. So he was very plugged into Enlightenment ideals, your Adam Smiths. You see that really coming into much of his most famous work. And Burns himself gathered all this together in the one lovely little space. He did so much of his reading, a tremendous amount of his writing, and a massive amount of his conversing, all next to the fire in small farm cottages in Ayrshire as he moved around during most of his first decades on Earth. So Burns, the kind of musical contributor, really emerged from the folk song tradition and infused the rhymes of his area with his genius and produced a lot of the work that we all know today.
Thank you so much. Patrick, a rather different view of the cosmopolitan, metropolitan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, similar but different. I mean, the same words, by the way, just in the first instance, to say thank you to everyone for having me here and for tuning in. But yeah, I'm fascinated by what Alistair is saying, precisely because this is all happening more or less at the same time as Mozart's childhood. Mozart's born just a couple of years before Burns, I think, in 1756. And of course, his childhood then becomes incredibly famous ever since, and extremely famous at the time. So it's rather a daunting prospect for anyone writing about him to tackle. And I think that one of the things to understand about Mozart is that it was actually, in the end, quite a daunting prospect for him to have been that child. And part of the underlying argument of my book is that it sort of took a lot to stop being that child, if you like, on Mozart's part. And it's really, in a way, his great accomplishment for me is that not that he was the great child genius prodigy, but that he managed to cease being that figure and become something more interesting. Burns, I think it sounds completely different on the other hand from the point of view of the stasis, because what happened to Mozart was he was exploding across Europe, largely as a result of his father's, combination of intense, understandable excitement at discovering this extraordinary prodigy, this amazing sort of gift, beyond his wildest dreams of what a talented child might be like. But also, of course, his father's, sometimes quite rapacious and peculiar pushiness. So Mozart was going everywhere and was being, feted amongst the crowned heads of Europe, amongst all the small courts, amongst the up and coming metropolises, comes and ends up in London for a rather peculiar stint over here on this island. And altogether sees a lot of Europe. It sounds as though Burns was an enormously absorbent figure in his own way. And I'm sort of interested in both cases. I don't know, I'd be interested to know what Alistair makes of this, but one of the things that I'm really struck by with Mozart's childhood is, yes, of course, he was extraordinary and had this amazing facility, this extraordinary talent. But it felt to me more and more, listening to the music of the time and trying to understand it within that context, that it was also important to say that Europe was sort of ready for a Mozart at this point, that the language of European music has reached a sort of pitch of both cosmopolitanism on the one hand, where everything is being transmitted in lots of different places, and also simplicity. There's been an enormous move towards simplification of the musical language over the middle of the 18th century. And I feel like Mozart's childhood is sort of a precipitate of this explosive energy that was coming out of European culture in general during that time.
So, Alistair, does Burns' success chime in with Scotland in general, Britain and Europe being ready for Burns' seeming simplicity?
There is so much there that I want to latch onto. I think, first of all, I'd make the point that Burns did explode into the world consciousness, but just at a later date when he was more mature. But even then, he found it to be an imposition, effectively a massive writer's block. It really seems to have fired his reliance on alcohol, which, really kind of dulled some of his abilities. And also, he said at one point, as an adult, when he was widely sort of famous and raking in the money and all the great and good wanted to see him and meet him, he said staring into his future was like staring down a bottomless pit. Like he's got no joy from his massive, massive fame, even though all of his writing up till then was like, one day I'm going to be famous.
But do you think that's sincere, or do you think that's a part of the image making?
No, I think Burns really did. A lot more learned people than me have noted his tendency to be sort of bipolar, to be at times utterly despairing for long, long periods, unable to get out of bed, even to do absolutely essential farm work. He just couldn't get his head off the blankets, and at other times to be utterly manic and be producing tremendous amounts of work and be the life and soul of 6 or 7 different parties and 6 or 7 different bedrooms, as we'll probably get onto. Yes. And yeah, so I think that idea of exploding onto a scene and finding that an artistic hurdle to be overcome is definitely intertwined. With Burns, the return to seeming simplicity is absolutely there in Burns. He was coming after a lot of poets, and he was very self-consciously coming after poets who were starting that turn towards nature, towards the romantic ideals, as life became more urban, as the world became more joined up. And a lot of poets that came just before him celebrated their tiny local areas, and he was great fans of them, people like Alexander Ross of Lochlee. But although his work is seemingly simple, it really does imbue many of the big Enlightenment ideas of the time. He was reading the philosophers, he was reading Adam Smith very, very keenly indeed, and weaving that into his work. And even his most famous works in Scots also have lots of Enlightenment English sections. Some of the most famous sections, if I can quote you a very small bit from Tam O'Shanter, which is famously long and in Scots, and non-Scots speakers will never have ever got as far as the English bit. He's talking about the fleetingness of pleasure, and I'll convert to my poetry lens for this. He says, but pleasures are like poppies spread. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like a snow falls on the river, a moment white, then melts forever. In the midst of this big, long Scots song, he brings Enlightenment English and learning to say, I am part of this. I am one of the learned people of my age, as well as a representative of where I'm from. And I think the anxieties of urbanization are in Burns. I think the anxieties of habitat destruction are in Burns. And I think that also desire for common men to engage in learning and engage in the big ideas is very present in his work. So yeah, he exploded. I think Burns would stand out in any era for his genius, but certainly he was latching on to the ideas that were so current that really brought, like they brought out and spoke to the anxieties of the age.
Yes. Can we just unpick Burns's political outlook a little, Alistair? Is that because it's always struck me that there's a wee bit of ambivalence in there.
It's not easy to pin Burns down to a political opinion, certainly because he joined up with the local militia and wore the red coat, you know, and he was ready away to go and work on a slave plantation.
Yeah.
These are true things. He worked in part of his life as an excise man, working for HMRC effectively. So things he definitely did, and he definitely enjoyed being part of the militia. He thought it was a rare old lark. These are definite concrete things you can pin down. And I saw people at the time of the last Scottish referendum on independence saying that, you know, Burns was actually very much part of the whole union. It was very happily part of the modern Britain he was existing in. And you can't argue too much with that. That definitely did exist to an extent. But also in Burns's work, there's so much speaking for the common people. There's so much speaking for Scotland. There's so much intentionally using the Scots language, which he does very strongly, that there's clearly various undercurrents at work within him. And I think that reflects the fact that he was living in a time of change. What is consistent, as a lot of that is inconsistent, what's consistent is that he was in favour of democracy. Like, not the democracy we'd understand it precisely, but the common people having a say over their own future. He writes with understanding from a point of view of a woman. One of his most famous songs, The Slave's Lament, is written from the perspective of an enslaved Senegalese person. Yeah. So he politically, he wanted good for the common people, I think, first and foremost. And everything else gets a bit hazy when you try and pin him down to anything more than that.
Patrick, I feel an aria from The Marriage of Figaro coming on.
Well, I think you'll all be grateful if I don't try it myself. But yeah, exactly. Marriage of Figaro is very much in the air when it comes to Mozart's politics. And in a way, it's in the air because I was thinking about the nature of political opinion, really, as such a complicated way of putting it, because Mozart had so many opinions. He was an extraordinarily voluble person. I mean, one other link between the two of them, of course, is that Mozart was a great, it sounds as though Burns was an enthusiastic sort of musical artist in some ways, and Mozart was a great verbal artist in his letters. And his opinions tend to be all over the place in them. He tends to praise people according to who's nice to him, tends to spit venom at people because it's fun to do so on a particular day. So it can be very hard to pin down his politics. But exactly, in the 1780s, he really finds, I think, a vehicle for all of the complexity of his vision of the world, I think, in The Marriage of Figaro. And he's very lucky in that it comes at a particular time in 1780s Vienna, where he's moved at the beginning of the decade, just as Joseph, he wasn't the new emperor exactly, but he'd become sole emperor after the death of his mother, Maria Theresa, the great sort of conservative, gargantuan figure, defining the very conservative vision of Habsburg culture that had dominated the middle part of the 18th century. And Mozart comes at a moment of extremely interesting reforms on Joseph's part. Joseph was a really complicated figure in his political views too, and I guess sums up some of the complexities of the age. One uses the dread phrase from history textbooks of the enlightened despot. These two elements of someone who's both very forward moving in some ways and very backward looking and autocratic and control freakish. And so Mozart was part of that moment. And in The Marriage of Figaro, he really finds a vehicle that allows him to express that moment, but express it through fiction and through an invented story that's already got a freighted political past of its own in Enlightenment Paris, no less, where Beaumarchais' play had been an extraordinary, but also very scandalous and very controversial success early in the 1780s. And Mozart finds a way of turning that into an opera that's even more colorful and exuberant than the original play, but also, because it's an opera, even more slippery and inclusive and ambiguous, I think, in its perspectives. So just as Alistair's saying about Burns, I think there's this extraordinary, amazingly sort of tender ventriloquial curiosity about other people's minds and emotions that powers a lot of Mozart's music and is at its most rich and sort of stunning in The Marriage of Figaro. But of course, we can and that certainly has its democratic side, and it's certainly part of the story of that opera in overturning the feudal order and showing how a servant, and particularly actually the servant's fiancée and then wife Susanna, overturn the ill wishes and evil intentions of their boss. But it also, of course, means that he's curious and tender and intrigued by the boss too, by the Count Almaviva, who's the villain, but who also is treated with extraordinary interest and exuberance too. So everything is turned on its head.
And has the most tender music of all at the very end.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Mozart also was kind of spanning different eras in terms of how musicians were employed, appearing in livery for the early parts of his career, but then moving not exactly towards a freelance life a la Beethoven, but pointing more in that direction. I mean, that was quite the change, wasn't it?
Exactly. He was not just spanning it, but he was trying to leap that. He was trying to throw rope bridges and gyro, every sort of grapple apparatus he could find to try and get over from one to the other. Because a crucial part of his politics is how much he ended up hating the world of servile courtly culture that had really also created him. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that makes him such an ambiguous figure and so telling.
Burns, could we also say that Burns moved in an opposite direction? He was happy to put his suit on to go to Edinburgh and consort with the literati there. Was he not, Alistair?
Yeah, like...
Oh, playing the Plowman poet?
Well, you say playing the Plowman poet. That's a really interesting one, because certainly there's an element of branding to that, but there is also the respect where he was that. Like he literally was a ploughman, and he quite liked himself. Like he probably didn't advertise how badly his farms tended to do, but he did. When he went to Edinburgh, I think he wore his ploughman poet status, and that was kind of worn for him. Like his Edinburgh sponsors, when he came to the city, introduced him as the heaven-taught ploughman. So he had to adapt to how he was being presented, and he certainly lent into that. And you're right, his method of sustenance was actually very familiar to us today. He crowdfunded. He got his family and social networks to pay in advance subscriptions for his books to be published in the early days. That's how he got out there. And then, yeah, he made his money through networking extremely well through all classes. And to do that, you do have to be a little bit of a chameleon. Again, Burns's letters, they make a remarkable study of the 17 or 18 people he could be on any one morning based on who he's trying to get in favor with. And he got money from some quarters. He always made just enough to get by, but he never mastered the income streams that he would have liked to have mastered. And yeah.
Boy, is that ever something they both had in common. Now, I've just had a very nice message, and a question has come in from Liam Brown. Let me just read it out. Would Burns and Mozart have felt themselves as living in tumultuous, transformative times, in perhaps the way we might say the same of ourselves today? Did they feel this wind of enlightenment as transformative?
Brilliant. Go for Mozart first, because I'm fascinated to hear.
Okay.
Go, Patrick, go.
I got more and more interested actually in the fact that Mozart's career as a major composer, obviously he began so early and it's hard to say exactly when his major career starts, but let's say, just because it's then politically, historically convenient for my argument, 1776, begins at around the time of the American Revolution. And of course it ends around the time of the French Revolution. And I became really interested in the fact that his work spans this period of strange transition historically between these different possibilities of change. He was in Paris in the late 1770s. My book, the sort of main set piece chapter that my book begins with, because it's mainly about the later career of Mozart, shows the sort of impasses that he was running up against in the rather sort of disillusioned, unsettled version of Enlightenment Paris that he was in 1778. And of course, that was the world that Jefferson and Franklin had all been celebrities in. Mozart was staying with this man called Baron Grimm, an extraordinary sort of entrepreneur of the pan-European Enlightenment. At its most sort of politically slippery and peculiar. And Mozart was absolutely sort of plugged in, I think, to the currents of these changes. But he was also at a funny margin. He was also just someone who had been brought up to be a pure entertainer in this world. So I think he had a sort of funny oblique attitude towards it that I think, actually plays out really interestingly in his career. And the 1780s, Vienna, again, is an extraordinarily complicated place, particularly once Joseph's reforms start to flounder in the middle of the decade, and we start to move towards the years of the French Revolution itself. Marie Antoinette, of course, it's easy to forget, was a Habsburg herself, was the sister of the Emperor Joseph and the sister of his successor Leopold, who was then in charge when things went really badly for her in Paris, of course. To say the least of it. So yeah, I think Mozart was completely plugged into these things, but I think also at an amazingly, one of the reasons of calling this book Mozart in Motion was that I think that there's an extraordinary sense in which the times were in motion, and with the intensity of the artistry, you have someone who's trying to be even more in motion than the times are, and sort of having to be even more in motion than the times are, having to write music that's that much more accelerative, that much more prodigious in its absorbency, just in order to stay ahead of the number of things that are going on and the number of different reactions that he had to it all.
Alistair, are there parallels there in the Athens of the North?
Well, I think absolutely, because they were living through the same times, and you couldn't live in those days as very literate people, as you know, Burns was, and not be acutely aware of the American Revolution and subsequent Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution as well. And that really, really informed Scottish life. So the first industrial revolution is just starting, particularly amongst the weaving class. And there's regular riots, and there's regular struggle amongst the weavers. And Burns writes a series of songs and poems about the weavers, about wooing a gallant weaver boy and all that kind of stuff from a woman's perspective, and kind of making the weavers into quite a heroic people. So he's deeply attuned to the political tumult at home, but he also had his eyes fixed on the bigger questions. The French and American revolutions really seem to inform his work like a man's a man for all that. So for them that aren't aware, that's a longer poem which is often sung, which basically celebrates the honest men over men of particular status, and is quite a bold social comment in the time of change. So yeah, I think that you couldn't have taken these men, they couldn't have produced these work in any other era. It was a time of tremendous change. Burns's Te Amus, actually, to go to another very famous one, addresses very straightforwardly the impact of the agricultural revolution. Scotland was changing rapidly from being a place where people would subsistence farm, scratch the soil a bit, they'd have infields and outfields with very simple techniques going back to the 1300s, to go into the foremost agricultural place on earth with really sophisticated drainage, really lined up farming, big loans being taken, massive overdrafts from the banks to pay for huge shifts, farm accumulation under increasingly powerful landlords, all the cotter class being driven out of existence. Burns writes about that in his poetry like Teamus and the Cotter Saturday Night, about this fundamental shift happening at ground level. So yeah, the tumult of the age is very imprinted in the works of Burns. Maybe because he had a kind of farmer's eye view of the world, it's more local, but you see the big ideas leaking through from newspapers and from texts into his poetry and song too.
Brilliant. That's really incredibly interesting from both of you. I'd like to just shift the focus a wee bit away now and talk about something Alistair touched on, Burns writing from a woman's perspective. I'm very struck with how wonderfully he did that, and in how many different variations on that theme, that he had the empathy to write John Anderson, My Joe, the Babi Klutz poem, poems in the voice of Jean Armour. And Mozart, meanwhile, was giving voice in his operas to women with an extraordinary degree of, well, again, empathy and just being able to give them literally a voice in the most sublime way. Can you just comment on this and perhaps the newness of that, if indeed you think it was new? Patrick, would you like to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really, it's a great link between them that I wouldn't have thought of. But yeah, exactly. I think one of the important things to say about that is that, of course, Mozart was giving women a voice in the operas, but actually opera and singing and 18th century vocal music had been one of the few places, you might say, but one of the clamorous and extraordinary places in which women had claimed voices all along through the whole of the 18th century. And it had been a really controversial facet of operatic life. In which
but they tended to be goddesses or priestesses, or
yeah, exactly. So it's about humanizing that process. Yeah. And Mozart in a way was listening to, I think in a way you could interpret some of his operas as a way of listening to that fact, listening to the fact that women were finding voices and saying, okay, well, what would they actually sing about if we really wanted to listen to what they want to sing about, and taking them seriously as actresses, as actors, as well as singers, taking them seriously as co-creators of his works. He has really strong relationships with particular singers, particularly in the 1780s, but going back actually to his time in Italy in the 1770s too. And I think learned a lot, an enormous amount from some of the strong women around him. The opera where it really comes to a head in the first instance is his first great Viennese opera, which is Die Entführung aus dem Seraglio, the abduction from the Seraglio, which conveniently enough for the purposes of sort of psychobiographical arguments has a woman character in it called Constanza, which happens to be, with the change of one vowel, the same name as the woman he was marrying at the time. And I think a lot of his powerful feelings about the possibilities of women in contemporary society are thrown into that character and thrown into the extraordinary music, the extraordinary power-claiming music, you might say, that he gives her.
Thank you. Alistair.
That is absolutely fascinating. With Burns, I would say that a lot of his work, particularly song, needs to be understood in the context of his audience. As I said, it was his mother and his female relatives that were the real singers around his house, and that would have been common across Scotland. It remains very embedded in the Scottish tradition today that women are considered to be the natural singers. They're the ones that perform the great Scots ballads. Most Burns singers today will be female. But also, he did a lot of his performing in drinking clubs. So I don't want to... Burns definitely did write from the perspective of women in a very human way. But also, he did also write in an extremely denigrating way about women. So he was both a product of his age and now and again, when he stood on tiptoe, able to see over the boundaries of misogyny that surrounded him to write some really powerful stuff from the perspective of women. You've referred to Joe Anderson, My Joe, already. I thought I'd just share a very short stanza from a great song called What Can a Young Lassie Do with an Old Man? And basically just saying, absolutely gutted I've married this old guy. He's always complaining frae morning till evening. He hosts and he hurples the weary day lang. He's doited and dozing, his blood it is frozen. Oh, dreary's the night with a crazy old man. So it is, there are these great fun, like he's allowing women to be, you know, horny. He's allowing women to be sort
That's
of
really
sexy.
interesting. The comedy aspect is really interesting there, because with Mozart, it was really the move from opera seria. It goes back to what Ian was saying about goddesses and priestesses. It's the move from opera seria to comic opera that was happening anyway during the later part of the century, but that Mozart really digs deeply into and invests in incredibly heavily. And that's what allows a more realistic, more humanized, more pluralizing, you know, version of identity generally, and certainly of gender politics to emerge.
So if I could just dig down a little in both lives, two interesting things to take the life partners, if we can use 21st century terminology. Jean Armour, with whom he had a very checkered life. She bore him 9 children. By most standards, he treated her appallingly, yet she went back for more. He cavorted with everything in a skirt. Meanwhile, I think it's fair to say, is it not? Mm-hmm. I wonder sometimes if those wonderful poems in her voice are slightly guilt-induced, or is that looking down the wrong end of the telescope, Alistair?
Well, that's a really interesting one. So we had a great event here in the Scottish Poetry Library where 3 modern female poets responded to Burns, and they had a number of observations that I think are very worth sharing because their perspectives were so refreshing. One was just from Morag Anderson. She wrote a fantastic poem from the perspective of Jean Armour, pointing out that actually maybe Burns was just really attractive. Everyone talks about, like Sir Walter Scott talked about, how remarkable and charismatic he was. He was maybe just a guy she was just mad about. And that's why she was with him. So the poems from her perspective, maybe she was just completely in love with him. And he felt guilt. He definitely didn't feel good about his behavior at times as well. So I don't think that he was leading his partners astray any more than he was leading himself astray. And Jean Armour herself was no daftey. She was very well aware that she said Burns should have had at least 2 wives, just to keep up.
Well, she got that bit right.
Yeah, there's his relationship with women is definitely a big question mark. He definitely had like at least 13 kids to a number of different women and treated some of them really appallingly indeed.
We won't make any Boris Johnson comparisons here. We'll move swiftly on to Mozart marrying the sister. So he woos first Aloysia Weber and then marries her sister Constanze. Aloysia remaining a prominent singer, including in his operas.
Exactly, becoming a really starry singer, and Constanze being in her shadow as a singer, apart from anything else, because they came from a family of performers. And Aloysia was the pretty brilliant one, and Constanze was the more homely one that Mozart had to, so to speak, settle for, and who had to settle for Mozart indeed, because he wanted to seem to be the second best. But I think it's amazingly, in a way, to both of their credits, that they made an extraordinary success of it, and I think she turned out to be a really important, accomplished, subtle figure in his life, and someone who really came into her own, and actually after his death too came into her own as someone who pursued his legacy really creatively and strong-mindedly.
Oh, could you just unpack that little, what you felt she contributed in his lifetime?
During his lifetime, I think that it's really about what begins to go wrong in the later 1780s. I mean, Mozart's financial shenanigans are another of the many, colorful and fascinating elements of his life that we all speculate about endlessly. But it seems like it was just a congenital aspect of his character, and a part of his sort of sense of largesse and part of his vision of himself as living on a grand scale, that he scattered money around and didn't know what to do with it. It was during the 1780s that this became really problematic, because essentially when a culture is moving up, when all ships are rising with the tides, etc., you can get away with being a sort of lunatic spendthrift like Mozart. But when things started to go badly for Joseph Vienna, around 1785, 1786, actually it became really troubling, and Mozart's debts began to mount. He began to commissions started to dry up. He wasn't getting the audiences that he'd been getting before. And gradually over those years, I think Constanze really comes into her own as someone who's holding everything together through thick and thin of his very voluble, peculiar lifestyle, his love of touring, his extravagant flirtations with other singers, etc., through her own unhappy, sometimes, experiences of childbirth and child rearing, through her own ill health. I think she becomes an incredibly substantial figure. And by 1790, 1791, it's clear that really she's the one holding the household together, and is essentially, treating Mozart as the figure she sends off to his death to do some composing, so that she can figure out how to pay the next load of debts.
Yeah. Gentlemen, can we move on to the subject of Freemasonry, as both these men were Masons? There was a lot of it in the air, and a lot of it connected to Enlightenment ideas and ideals. Alistair, would you like to jump in?
Sure. So Masonry was very embedded in Burns's Ayrshire that he grew up in. Burns loved a get-together. He loved a good, a lads wee party. So he founded a local singing club. He founded a bachelor's club, and he would have been drawn like a moth to a flame to something like the Masons, with its drinking, with its kind of camaraderie, with its sense of brotherhood. Absolutely, that would have been right up his street. What it also would have given him was access to networks, which as a Plowman poet, he wouldn't have had instant access to. There's a lot of kind of reading the tea leaves about the actual Masonic connections, because obviously there's not great records for that. But when he came to Edinburgh, he did meet a number of prominent Masons, and it seems like those Masonic connections were vital in him going from the Kilmarnock edition, which is a few hundred copies paid for by subscription from families, to a print run of 3,000 bought up by the great and the good of Edinburgh. So his Masonic connections were definitely significant. Just the other day, I was in the Dundee Burns Club, which is currently being brought back from the dead, effectively. And one of the pieces of art, which they've found covered in stour down the back of one end of a cupboard, is the standard Burns the Plowman poet, but in full Freemasonry. And the Dundee Burns Club were absolutely buzzing about the fact that Burns was a Mason. So it's something that Burns definitely played to as much as he could to get what he could from it. And also the Masons have absolutely loved playing to as well, like the fact that the National Bard was one of their own. In terms of his work, it doesn't seem to be massively impactful, but in terms of the networks that allowed him to do his work, I think Freemasonry definitely did play a role.
Thank you. Patrick, are there parallels?
There certainly are, yeah, that sounds remarkably similar in the sense of that Mozart would just have joined any organization that had jolly gatherings and opportunities to dress up and impress people and chatter away about current affairs. I mean, he was just an extraordinarily gregarious figure. Similarly, I think also the desire for networks, and that sort of move that I was mentioning earlier from being a sort of courtly employee, not to say a rather servile one, in the previous dispensation that was still an incredibly powerful paradigm for musicians, towards some version of the freelance lifestyle. The Freemasonry was an important part of that for Mozart in 1780s Vienna. But I think it's also important to say, and this is so incredibly various from place to place, what an extremely interesting and fecund phenomenon 1780s Freemasonry was in Vienna. It was such an extraordinarily plural phenomenon. I mean, from lodge to lodge, it made a big difference. Which particular strand you belong to, which one you were adhering to, what sort of mood Joseph was in as to his views on Freemasonry during the 1780s, because that changed a lot. And essentially there were three different grand historical forces, you might say, coming together in Freemasonry. There was a sort of cosmopolitan feeling for political enlightenment, a sort of political agenda. There was a reinvention of religion and religiosity, and which was, a peculiar mixture of sort of esoteric backwoodsness and extremely modern, convoluted critiques of conventional religion. And there was also the scientific element, sort of men of science. And unfortunately, we are mainly talking about men. That's one of the many political blind spots that Freemasonry very much continued not just to uphold, but to cultivate, unfortunately, during the period. So it had these three different elements that really brought together a lot of what Mozart was interested in this amazingly sort of free-floating, sort of eclectic, peculiar, spirited, and hypermobile way that, of course, culminates in the Magic Flöte, Zauberflöte, Mozart's final great comic opera, which comes, interestingly, a few years, right at the end of his life, which is after the high watermark of Freemasonry as a great utopian hope almost for change and progress and a different vision of political possibilities in Vienna earlier on. And the Magic Flute is so strange because it's sort of an elegy for Freemasonry at the same time as it's a celebration of it.
I'd never thought of that. That's extremely interesting. So it's out of kilter with the
exactly out of kilter, and there's a sense in which it shows the out of kilterness that was within Freemasonry all along, if you like. That it was always something that it's you know, I guess it goes back to my point about this period between these two revolutions. That it's a world that doesn't quite know how modern it's able to be. It's a world that doesn't quite know how critical it is of the past, doesn't quite know whether it's inventing elaborate and brave futures or reverting to type in all sorts of backwards, hyper-conservative and reactionary ways. And I think Freemasonry is really such an interesting phenomenon because it has that equivocation, that set of equivocations built into it. It's not quite clear whether, you know, why on earth would you dress up as an Egyptian prince in order to invent the political future? Well, it's not that much stranger than the founders of the American Republic dressing up in their minds as Roman senators in order to found political modernity. You know, there's something very odd going on in this flow of historical time, you might say, during this period that I think Freemasonry generally, and then the Magic Flute in particular, are really alive to.
Can we just discuss the, to use a contemporary kind of concept, the image of both men at their peak in their lifetimes, and then how that changed after their respective deaths? Burns, we've talked a bit, Alistair, about the combination between what was natural to him, what was his life trajectory, and what was cultivated and what was, if you like, spun. So by the time he died so tragically young, how was he? How famous was he actually at his death?
These are great questions. Can I say Patrick's bit there was absolutely fascinating. That was great stuff. I'm loving learning more about Mozart. It's really enjoyable. Burns's legacy is vast and it's so complex and it's so international. Like just the other day, I was listening to a lecture about the 200 odd years of tradition of Ukrainian translations of Burns into Ukrainian, where he's regularly taught, and there's a regular Shevchenko and Burns supper that they have in Ukraine and have done for a long, long time. Like he's so international and he was read all over. He was massively famous in his lifetime. He was welcome everywhere. His letters came from everywhere. In fact, a wee Ulster connection, an indication of his fame is the fact that both at his time and in the decades after his death, there were constantly rumours and stories about Burns coming to Ulster. So Ulster people would say, oh yeah, no, Burns came over, he attended a market, he went to this pub, that pub, had a whale of a time, went back over the shoot, thought it was grand. And there's lots of stories from different market towns in the kind of the Ards Peninsula and up that kind of east coast of Northern Ireland, where Burns was reputed to have been, in the way that you might say, like, you know, William Wallace's cave and that kind of thing, and like where Robert the Bruce hung out. Rabbi Burns, the people of Ulster were desperate for Rabbi Burns to have been there. There doesn't seem to be any concrete evidence he went there, but you can tell from his correspondence, which was absolutely international, that he was held in tremendous esteem by men and women of letters everywhere. Since his death, it's been a constant tumult. Something we've used Burns for as a very long time is a gateway for national discussion. So we'll pin to Burns whatever the great trouble of the nation is at any one time. So at the moment in the kind of Me Too era, the Burns season around kind of the end of January has been dominated by discussions of his relationships with women. And there's been fantastic, really useful national discourse held around that, but it means that his dirty laundry is washed in public. Rewind a few years and, you know, the Temperance Society really pointed to, they were, you know, a working people's society. The Temperance Society said, Burns, our great working class hero, was ruined by the drink. Look at his whiskey sodden. Look how beholden he was to the demon drink. If he could have been free of it, we could have had 40 more years with him. So Burns's legacy has become so huge and so iconic and so multifaceted that really we now we can only deal with aspects of Burns at any one time, and we use him for national conversations. You don't get much more famous than that. But the exact sort of fame he has changes by what sort of national icon we need year to year.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, the peculiar thing about Mozart from this point of view is that, of course, his career was conducted in the shadow of his own image as a child. He was conducting a sort of war on his own image right from the moment when he set himself to become, what you might call a more serious composer in his late teens, early 20s. And that process is only really reaching its culmination and reaching its point of success, where he really had established himself as this absolutely major, dominant artistic figure just as he dies. I mean, because of his early death. So his whole career is spent, his major period as a composer is spent, if you like, in between these two images. You got the wunderkind image of him as the delightful young kid sitting on the laps of countesses, improvising amazing things on the harpsichord. And then we have this image of Mozart, the great composer, on his deathbed writing the Requiem, if you like, and that sets the seal on him. And Constanza, again, his wife, became very important, and I think very creatively important and ingenious in setting up that image and in arranging things and in making sure that his estate was all brought together. But Mozart himself lived actually between those two images, if you like, and didn't quite know that he was ever going to traverse he knew who he was. He knew he was rhapsodically, or sometimes uncannily, sure of his own powers. But he was also constantly baffled by other people's failure to receive him with the sort of rapture that he thought that he deserved. He thought that he could carry on essentially being applauded as the brilliant young child, while also doing extraordinarily innovative and peculiar and difficult new types of work. So his image, I think, I think we've ended up with the right image of him as a serious, imposing figure in our musical landscape. But I think it's also worth, in a way, keeping them together as well, those two images, and going back to the sort of playful child, going back to that vision of creative playfulness and insouciance and pure delightfulness that's thrumming away through the cultural grandeur that he attained.
Wonderful. Thank you, gents. I'm going to ask you now, among our listeners here in this conversation, I'm sure there are some who are more Burns slanted in their knowledge and enthusiasm, and others who are more Mozart slanted. What can you just give a couple of pieces or works from each poet/composer that you would recommend to those who don't know much about Burns or Mozart? Of the vast array of masterpieces to choose from, what would be a couple of good starting points?
Oh, great. Yeah, if you don't mind me going first, one of the songs I love most is the one that I hear least because it's notoriously difficult to sing. It was composed on his deathbed. He was being cared for by the wife of a good friend, and he knew he was dying, and he wanted to leave a piece of music, a piece of song, to acknowledge his love, not romantic love, but love all the same, to this woman that was caring for him at his last. And it's called O Wert Thou in the Cauld Blast. And it is absolutely beautiful. It's set to a famous melody, which I cannot for the life of me immediately remember, but was a notoriously difficult melody, but it was her favourite. And she was nursing and caring for him in the same sort of humble environment that he was born in. And the song is huge, and it draws upon so much of his talent, so much of his genius. And I would really recommend all the Mozart fans of you in the group, O Wert Thou in the Cauld Blast. I think Rod Patterson's version on Spotify, free, go and get a listen to it. It's absolutely outstanding.
Actually, can I jump in on that? Wearing my muso hat, did you know that was one of the poems that was also set in Russian by Shostakovich? And he said, as you mentioned, in Russia and Ukraine, Burns was famously a postage stamp. He was revered because of the political heritage and working class hero, etc., etc. But Shostakovich said several Burns poems in translation, of which this is one, and it was dedicated to his wife, and it has been decoded since as being a comment on surviving the Stalinist unpleasantness.
Unpleasantness
of Burns meaning different things to different people at different times and different removes. So
that's fascinating. No, I loved it. Thank you.
It's very austere. It's a very austere setting. There's very few notes. It's very low. It's very dark. So Yeah, different times, different mores. Patrick.
Yeah, I'm going to indulge myself by mentioning three things and trying to restrain myself from mentioning 123. Just because I think it's important to say at least one vocal work. And I think in this case, just because I've been talking about his relationship with his wife, and I think it's a sort of homage to her, I would recommend listening to the aria that I also write about in the book, the Et Incarnatus Est aria from the Great Mass in C from early in the 1780s. It's the most extraordinarily ravishing piece of vocal music. It's not an opera, which is maybe remiss on my part, but it's extremely operatic in its sense of emotion and drama. Then I would have to say at least one keyboard piece, I suppose. And in this case, I think I'd go for actually the K331 sonata, which is famous for ending with the uproarious, peculiar, I think very strange in its way, Rondo alla Turca, which is one of the tunes that everyone recognizes. If you hear it, I'm not. They are the worst rendition of Rondo alla Turca I've ever heard.
I don't have to listen to it now.
There's a special bonus for this broadcast. But it begins with a set of theme and variations that are enormously learned and expansive and subtle, and it's about Mozart traversing all the different possibilities of musical language in the period. And then I think my personal favorite is it's a piece that I think should be better known than it is. It's one of the, I think, supreme masterpieces of our musical past, but because it's written for the strange combination of a violin and a viola as a sort of double concerto. This is the Sinfonia Concertante that he wrote just at the moment of transition that I've been talking about between his Salzburg life under the thumb and in the shadow of his father and his life in Vienna. And it's, for me, the great transition work between the two, where he uses the two instruments really to work out an extraordinarily elaborate and I think also very moving, vision of artistic identity.
Well, those are great answers. I think we're winding down now. So if anyone out there with mostly blank faces would like to ask a question of these learned gentlemen, now is your chance, just as we're winding up. If anyone would like to say anything, put it in the chat. Yeah,
I quite like the fact the sun's been setting on us as we've been talking. So it's getting increasingly gloomy.
It's the end of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a message there. So I feel like a Christie's auctioneer at this point. Going. Any more for any more? Well, in that case, I think we'll just wind up. I think this has been a fantastic conversation, and I've loved not just the erudition from you two chaps, but your enthusiasm has been so palpable and so infectious.
I loved it. I'm off to read Patrick's book now. That was cracking.
I think it's been really nice coming together, actually. Yeah, I really have enjoyed it. It's been terrific.
And good luck with everything on Saturday, guys. I reckon this could be outstanding.
Yeah.
If you want to send me comps on a flight, then I'll be there.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who took part in this today. Patrick, Ian, and Alistair. I found it absolutely enthralling. I know a little bit about Burns. I know very little about Mozart, and I was just very engaged and interested the whole way through that, and looking forward to hearing more from both of you and reading your work. On behalf of the Linen Hall Library, I'd like to thank everyone who took part in this. I'd also like to thank our main funders for the festival. That's Belfast City Council, the Department for Communities, the Ulster Scots Agency, and the Arts Council of Northern Ireland. Also our sponsors, McConnell, Chartered Surveyors and Property Consultants, Ethisphere, and Gallagher Premiership Rugby. And I would like to thank all of you in the audience tonight for coming along this evening. We hope to see you possibly on Saturday at the recital. And if not, there are plenty more Enlightenment Festival events over on our website. Do check those out. And I hope to see you at some of them. Thank you and good evening.
Thanks.